Good morning and welcome. I am Master Chief Charles Lindsay, the Command Master Chief for Coast Guard District 13, and I'm honored to be your Masters of Ceremonies this morning. We are honored to have the following distinguished guests attending in today's memorial. Rear Admiral Richard Grumlick, Coast Guard District 13. The Honorable Charles Glondo, Mayor of City of Cle Elum. The Honorable James DeVere, Mayor of City of South Cle Elum. And the Honorable Joff Scher, Mayor of the City of Roslyn. Commander Doug Sheehan, U.S. Coast Guard retired, nephew of Douglas Munro and his son Patrick. Mr. Chris Sheehan and his family, nephew of Douglas Munro. Master Chief Philip, the second Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard. I'm sorry, Master Chief Phil Smith. Master Chief, thank you so much for coming out today. Master Chief Michael Levitt, the 11th Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard, and his wife Debbie. Thank you, Master Chief, for coming out. Master Chief Lonnie Kell Jones, the Deputy Master Chief Petty Officer of the Coast Guard, who's with us today from Washington, D.C. Lonnie, thank you. Lieutenant Scott Reed, the Commanding Officer of Marine Corps Security Force Battalion, Bangor. Sergeant Major Tim Riggs, the Marine Corps Sergeant Major for Security Force Battalion. Master Chief Cliff Tatum, Marine Corps Security Force Battalion, Bangor. And Commander Jim Ottemiller, and members of the Veterans of Foreign Wars, Douglas Munro, Robert H. Brooks, Post 1373. Thank you very much for being here today. The Greater Seattle chapter of the Coast Guard Chief Petty Officers Association is honored to welcome all of you to the annual wreath laying and remembrance ceremony to honor Signalman First Class Douglas Munro, a United States Coast Guard hero and Medal of Honor recipient. Would everyone please rise for the national anthem of the United States and the presentation of colors. Color Guard, present the colors.
Attention.
And salute.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Ready, two. I'd like to present Chaplain Michael Greenwalt, the Coast Guard District 13 Chaplain, who will deliver the invocation.
formation, please stand at ease. A reading from the 144th Psalm. Blessed be the Lord, my rock, who trains my hands for war, my fingers for battle. My rock and my fortress, my stronghold and my deliverer. My shield, and he in whom I take refuge, who subdues the people under him. O Lord, what has man that thou dost regard him, or the Son of Man that thou dost think of him? Man is like a breath, his days are like a passing shadow. O Lord, come, stretch forth thy hand from on high. Rescue me and deliver me. Now I invite you to join with me for a word of prayer. Gracious Father, in a place made sacred by the service and the sacrifices of the men and women who have found their eternal rest within its soil, in a place made sacred by a loving God whose very breath is hope and whose whisper is the song which sings beyond the grave, we gather today in humility, in reverence, and in awe. Blessed by those who gather here today, sanctified by the lives of those who have been recalled and remembered in this place, by the passion and compassion which your Spirit ever stirs within the hearts of men and women, lifting them up to extraordinary acts of both love and sacrifice. And so in our remembrance today of our Coast Guard brother Signalman First Class Douglas Munro, as we remember his courage, as we recount his unwavering commitment to preserve the lives of others, as we honor his dedication which called for the highest of sacrifices, upon his memory and upon those his acts saved bring blessing. Pour out your blessings upon the freedoms, the missions, and the people of our nation who know such privilege and possibility through the sacrifices of Signalman First Class Munro and through the countless heroes, known and unknown, since he gave his life. In our memorial, may we never forget that dedication demands sacrifice, that liberty requires service, that real freedom is truly costly. Amen.
Ladies and gentlemen, please be seated. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Rear Admiral Richard Gromlich as today's guest speaker. A native of Milton, Pennsylvania, Rear Admiral Gromlich graduated from the U.S. Coast Guard Academy in 1983 with a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering. He completed naval flight training in Pensacola, Florida in 1986 and logged more than 3,600 flight hours, attaining qualifications as an aircraft commander and instructor pilot on the HH-65 and as an aircraft commander in the HH-60J. As a rotary wing aviator, Rear Admiral Gromlich previous operational and command tours of duty include Commanding Officer of Coast Guard Aircraft Repair and Supply Center, ARSC, and now Aviation Logistics Center in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. Executive Officer of Air Station Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and Aeronautical Engineering Officer at Air Station Savannah, Georgia. He also served as an inventory manager, Chief of the Logistics Support Branch, and Chief of the Engineering and Industrial Support Division at ARSC. Other tours of duty include Air Station North Bend, Oregon, Air Station San Diego, California, and afloat as a deck watch officer above the 180-foot buoy tender of the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Pawpaw in Charleston, South Carolina. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce Rear Admiral Richard Gromlich.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. What an honor for me to be here today with you, and I just appreciate the absolute tremendous turnout that we've got here. This is the third year now that I've been able to participate in this ceremony, and I think the numbers continue to get bigger. And certainly, this is the largest Coast Guard contingent that I've seen so far. So thank you to the COs, the officers in charge, for really encouraging our folks to come out and practice what we consider the manners of our profession. This is an important day for the Coast Guard, and I thank you all for being here. To Master Chief Smith, Master Chief Levitt, Master Chief Cal Jones, thank you all for being here and making the effort. You set the tone for this ceremony and for all of our Coast Guard men and women. For the mayors, I'm not sure if they made it or not. If you did, again, thank you. Thanks to the Sheehan family, Doug, Patrick, Chris, great seeing all of you again. Thanks for everybody that had a part in setting up this ceremony, our Sea Cadets, our vocalists, the buglers, and particularly for our brothers from the Marine Corps and the security battalion out of Bangor. Thank you for being here. You honor us with your presence as well. As I said, it really is an honor for me to be here today as we commemorate the 73rd anniversary of Douglas Munro's heroic actions on Guadalcanal. I was honored to speak at this ceremony 2 years ago, and it was the first opportunity for me to visit Cle Elum, to this sacred site, to meet so many of you. And on that occasion, I spoke to you about shipmates and what that term means, and the incredible bond between two young men, Douglas Munro and Ray Evans. Today, I'd like to talk about heroes, both past and present. But let me first set the scene. Douglas Munro, a young man from Cle Elum, enlisted in the Coast Guard in 1939. The world was a dangerous and uncertain place at that time. The Nazis had invaded Poland. The Japanese blockaded the British concession in Tianjin, China, beginning a crisis which almost caused an Anglo-Japanese war in the summer of 1939. Following the invasion of Poland, United Kingdom, France, New Zealand, and Australia declared war on Germany. And on September 8th, President Roosevelt proclaimed a national emergency. World War II had begun in Europe. By 1941, fear and uncertainty swept across the globe. The American way of life and the way of life for free people everywhere were placed in grave jeopardy. By 1941, Douglas Munro had achieved numerous qualifications as a Coast Guardsman and had been promoted several times. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and inflicted devastating damage on the Pacific Fleet. Within hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor, American outposts on Guam, Wake, and Midway were feeling the fury of Japanese attacks. Americans in the Philippines were under intense attack from Japanese forces and reeling in a heroic and desperate struggle of their own. We were at war and were on the defensive. During the first 8 months of the Pacific War, the Japanese had moved down through the Pacific on a path of conquest that seemed unstoppable. In spite of the monumental defeat of the Japanese Imperial Navy, that the Japanese Imperial Navy had suffered at Midway in early June, the Japanese Army had yet to be stopped. Next in the path of the Japanese conquest was New Guinea, the Bismarck Archipelago, and the Solomon Island chain. From the Solomons, the Japanese could develop airfields and naval bases from which supply lines from the U.S. mainland and Hawaii to Australia would be cut. The war in the South Pacific would be lost. By June 1942, the Japanese had begun construction of an airfield in the vicinity of Lunga Point, Guadalcanal. Once completed, Australia would be cut off. Out of these circumstances emerged one of the most significant battles of World War II. Under the operation plan deemed Operation Watchtower, would land the Marines of the 1st Marine Division at Guadalcanal and seize the Japanese airfield and ultimately control the island. Earlier I mentioned I was going to talk about heroes today. Webster's defined hero as a person who is admired for courage and noble qualities. And I can think of no group more deserving of that title than our World War II Coast Guard coxswains that manned LCVPs, or landing craft vehicle personnel, more affectionately known as Higgins boats. They were tasked with one of the most important roles in World War II, amphibious operations, getting men to the beaches and providing support with reinforcements and supplies. The handling of these small craft in the surf is a specialized skill, and it was not common among men and women in the other services. Not so for men in the Coast Guard. Many of the coxswains had learned this skill from handling boats in the surf at life-saving stations. In fact, Coast Guard coxswains from life-saving stations were the most seasoned small boat handlers in government service. As only experienced men could successfully maneuver landing craft through strong currents, reefs, sandbars, and heavy surf, their contributions to amphibious operations were immeasurable. The American assault on Guadalcanal began on 7 August 1942. Douglas Munro and the Coast Guard took part in that assault and many others. The Japanese were taken completely by surprise, and it looked like the first American offensive action of the war, a very risky gamble. It looked like it would be a success. The Japanese, recognizing the strategic importance of Guadalcanal and the airfield, refused to cede control and rapidly reinforced their troops on the island. Intense jungle, air, and naval warfare ensued. The action continued on September 27, 1942. A Marine force, supported by Coast Guard operated landing craft, was to conduct a three-pronged attack on Japanese forces in 3 locations, including Point Cruz on Guadalcanal. 2 of the 3 prongs did not land. Douglas Munro and his 10-boat Higgins boat detachment landed a 500-man Marine battalion at Point Cruz and then conducted a retrograde. The Marines advanced up the beachhead to a ridge where they were engaged by an overwhelming and coordinated Japanese attack. The Japanese were attacking from all sides and eventually cut the Marines off from the beach. They were attacking with small arms, machine guns, and mortars with devastating effect. Douglas Munro was informed of the Marines' predicament. They needed to be evacuated, but how could this be done? The beach was fire-swept. A Marine rescued by Munro and his men later recounted, "No one in their right mind would approach such deadly chaos in a Higgins boat." As the Marines called for the 5-inch guns of a Navy destroyer, they followed close to the huge explosions as they made their way down the beach, taking casualties and carrying their wounded with them to the Higgins boats, operated by their dauntless Coast Guard comrades. When Signalman First Class Douglas Munro noticed a Japanese force maneuvering to attack the retrograding Marines, he positioned his craft between the enemy and the Marines in an attempt to provide covering fire, thus drawing the Japanese fire to himself. His actions saved the Marines, but ultimately cost him his life. And we all know his final words. Did they get off? Throughout the Pacific Theater, Coast Guardsmen manned their Higgins boats and transported Marines between ships and beaches, often under heavy fire. In addition, there are numerous stories of Coast Guard coxswains wading to the beach, picking up rifles and fighting alongside Marines for weeks at a time after their Higgins boats were sunk or destroyed. Thanks to efforts like these, the 2 services quickly developed a deep respect for one another, a respect that was further reinforced by Munro's actions more than 70 years ago and still endures today. Matthew Constantino, one of the Marines evacuated that day, embodies that mutual respect and recently said, "We were in enemy-infested land, and the Coast Guard saved our lives that day." In fact, one unofficial Marine Corps website lists all the Marines who have earned the Medal of Honor throughout history, and it intentionally includes Douglas Munro as a way of honoring him. General Jim Amos, the former commandant of the Marine Corps, once said, "I personally walked the beaches of Guadalcanal, studied the fight at Tulagi, and am intimately familiar with the heroism of Signalman First Class Douglas Munro. The story of his life and untimely death evacuating Marines from a hotly contested beachhead represents the deep and abiding bond between our Marines and their brothers and sisters in the United States Coast Guard. Our future together as members of a strong, relevant, and ready naval service is bright." So where do people like Douglas Munro come from? They come from Cle Elum. They come from small towns. They come from big cities across this great country of ours. They're willing to risk their lives to save the lives of others, many times not even knowing who those others are. Without Douglas Munro's bravery and inspiring leadership, 500 Marines would have been massacred. Marines such as the famous Louis Chesty Pulla, one of the most famous, among the most decorated Marines in history. Then a lieutenant colonel who rose to the rank of lieutenant general. Without the combat power of those saved Marines, who knows how the Battle of Guadalcanal would have eventually turned out. And what if Douglas Munro had not performed those acts that day? We'll talk about those 500 Marines. What about the thousands of others that were impacted by his heroics? I gave a talk last November on Veterans Day in Bellevue, and I talked about Coast Guard heroes. I talked about people like Lieutenant Jack Ritticher, a helicopter pilot who gave his life in Vietnam, going to the rescue of downed pilots. I talked about Douglas Munro and Ray Evans, and and what they did and the bond that they had. And after the event was over, a young woman came up with tears in her eyes, and she said, "I just want to let you know that my grandfather was on Guadalcanal that day." She said, "I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Douglas Munro." And by the end of that discussion, I had tears flowing as well as her. Many of you know that our new Coast Guard headquarters, which we dedicated back in November 2013, was named for Douglas Munro, the Douglas A. Munro Coast Guard Headquarters building. And during that ceremony, Admiral Bob Papp, our former commandant, had this to say: "Our Coast Guard is fortunate to have many great heroes. We have a long history of men and women with the courage to navigate those uncertain and stormy seas that drive others to safe harbor. Douglas Munro was one of those people. His last words, asking about the Marines, did they get off? With his dying breath, he thought not of himself, but of those he had gone to rescue. Douglas Munro defines us. He captures perfectly who we are as Coast Guardsmen and provides a stirring example of our service ethos. I will protect them, I will defend them, I will save them. I am their shield." Too often when people ask about our Coast Guard, we talk about our missions, and that's important. We do a lot of great things. But if you want someone to know our story, don't tell them what we do. Tell them about Douglas Munro and Ray Evans. What defines us as Coast Guardsmen is not what we do, but who we are and how we do it. I can assure you that the spirit of Douglas Munro is alive and well today, alive and well in the hearts and minds of our young Coast Guardsmen, many of them standing in front of you today. I see this each and every day in the actions of our Coast Guard men and women throughout the 13th Coast Guard District, those who continually put service before self so that others may live. The young men and women who expertly maneuver small boats across breaking bars and into treacherous seas at night, not knowing who it is in peril, but willing, like Douglas Munro, to risk everything so that others may live. I am certain Douglas Munro would be proud today. I know that I am. Thank you for being here today with us. Semper Fidelis and Semper Paratus.
Thank you, sir. Wreath bearers, please post for the presentation of the wreaths. Military members, attend. Hut! The wreath bearers this morning are Mr. Ernest Johnson, representing the Coast Guard Combat Veterans, Chief Warrant Officer Randy Somerville, representing the Chief Warrant Officers Association, Chief Dan Jem, representing the Coast Guard Chief Petty Officers Association, Chief Andrea Lorette, representing Coast Guard Cutter Midget, and SK3 Joanna McDonald, representing the Coast Guard Enlisted Association. Wreath bearers, please place the wreaths on Signalman First Class Douglas Munro's graveside. The actual medal was given to Douglas Munro's parents, Mr. and Mrs. James Munro, by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in a ceremony at the White House on Thursday, May 27, 1943. The citation reads, awarded posthumously to Douglas Albert Munro, Signalman First Class, United States Coast Guard, for extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry in action above and beyond the call of duty as officer in charge of a group of Higgins boats engaged in the evacuation of a battalion of Marines trapped by enemy Japanese forces at Point Cruz, Guadalcanal on September 27, 1942. After making preliminary plans for the evacuation of nearly 500 beleaguered Marines, Munro, under constant risk of his life, daringly led 5 of his small craft towards the shore. As he closed the beach, he signaled the others to land, and then in order to draw the enemy's fire to protect the heavily loaded boats, he valiantly placed his craft with its 2 small guns as a shield between the beachhead and the Japanese. When the perilous task of evacuation was nearly completed, Munro was killed by enemy fire, but his crew, 2 of whom were wounded, carried on until the last boat had loaded and cleared the beach. By his outstanding leadership, expert planning, and dauntless devotion to duty, He and his courageous comrades undoubtedly saved the lives of many who otherwise would have perished. He gallantly gave up his life in the defense of his country. At this time, Marines from Marine Corps Security Force Battalion Bangor will render a 21-gun salute.
The magazine around. Load. Ready. Hey. Fire. Ready. Hey. Fire. Ready. Hey. Fire. Present. Fire.
Hand salute. Ready, 2. This concludes today's ceremony. Thank you to the MFPU Bangor's Chiefs Mess for setting up the memorial. A special thanks to the VFW Commander Jim Ida Miller of the Veterans of Foreign Wars for helping to arrange this assembly. Thank you for all of you who came today, and thanks to the members of the VFW Post Douglas Munro, Robert H. Brooks, Post 1373. And thank you, Admiral Brownlick, for being our guest speaker this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.